Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here, back with another Spacedock short, and this time I thought it would be interesting to list off every canon class of colonial Battlestar in the RDM Battlestar Galactica timeline. There are 6 of them in total, so let's get right into it. Okay, I've tried to arrange this list in chronological order of commissioning, which kind of becomes difficult to assess later in the list, but one thing that we do know for sure is that the first Battlestar was the Artemis-class light Battlestar, as featured in Battlestar Galactica DEADLOCK. Now, in using this ship, the DEADLOCK team have continued a tradition that the TV show itself used of adapting ship designs from the 1978 Battlestar Galactica series and using them to represent first Cylon War designs in the RDM timeline. I think that's a genius move and a really good way to give a shout out to the original show, and this ship might be the most impressive example of it in the reboot timeline. The alterations made to the model are fairly subtle, mostly to incorporate ballistic weapons rather than the energy weapons the original show used, and slight changes to the engine module which I think look a lot better on this version than the original. The result here is what I think is one of the coolest looking ships in the BSG canon, one of the most fun to play with in the game, not quite as large as a Jupiter class with its length coming in at 1080 meters, but a little bit more maneuverable and agile with the focus on dorsal weaponry. It's very satisfying to see these ships firing full salvos from the top layers as they dive underneath Cylon vessels. The kind of interlaced diagonal launch tubes along the flight pods all look really cool when they're launching the Mark I Vipers, and it's completely believable that this is the focal point design from which all future Battlestars were spawned. A really gorgeous ship, one of my favourite on this list, and probably the most interesting and innovative use of the lore that's been used in ship backstories for the BSG canon. Next up, it's the Galactica herself, the Jupiter class, one of the most iconic sci-fi ship designs ever. This is the centerpiece of the colonial design style across Battlestar Galactica, and it's really awesome. The whole enduring aesthetic of the central body and the 2 flight pods is a really cool format to spin all of these designs out of. It's got a great presence on screen, very sleek and utilitarian, with more of a kind of smooth and tapered hull than a lot of the other Battlestars on this list. We've seen various iterations of this ship throughout different bits of Battlestar content. The original Jupiter class that was rolled out when they were first designed appears to have 3 support struts between the flight pods and the main body. Later in the war, after 10 years, we see the Galactica has mountains of guns strapped to it. Seems to be some kind of late war improvised upgrade. And then by the time we see the ship in the 2004 miniseries, it's had a lot of its armor stripped away. It's being turned into a museum, and it's one of, if not the last, Jupiter class ship in service. The Jupiters were originally designed as a very expensive accompaniment to the Articles of Colonization, partially as an encouragement to get colonies to sign on, and partially as a defensive measure against the Cylons. After the original prototype hull, the Battlestar Jupiter, we then got 12 ships, 1 for each of the colonies, the first of which was the Battlestar Galactica, which was assigned to Caprica. The very fact that there is a ship of this class still in service by the time of the TV show, even if it's only being used as a museum, is indicative of how well designed this ship was and how long-lasting the model turned out to be. Ships like the Artemis had long since been decommissioned by the time the Second Cylon War rolled around, and of course we see the Galactica acquits itself incredibly well throughout the Second Cylon War in the show, despite being woefully outclassed by almost everything it comes up against most of the time. This is the only ship on this list which is required to retract its flight pods in order to use its FTL drive. This seems to be some kind of structural quirk of these ships. It's possible that it's because it's such a large vessel and it was designed in the same era as the Artemis very early on. Perhaps the limitations of FTL systems allowed a smaller ship like the Artemis to be jumped safely, but a larger ship needed to retract its pods in order to be a more solid and smaller object to survive transit. I imagine it's very possible that FTL drives have advanced since then, as ships like the Mercury class are more than capable of jumping without retracting their pods, despite being even larger than the Jupiter. But either way, it's another little technical quirk that adds some character to the ship and places it somewhere in the lore with a little bit of extra world building detail that we can read into. Great stuff. Though this has never been my favourite class of Battlestar, I can certainly understand why this ship is so utterly beloved by so many fans of the series and of science fiction in general. Pretty much never before has a ship been made so endearing and given so much character as the Galactica is in its own show. If you don't love this ship by the end of the series, you've been doing something wrong. Brilliant design, a character unto itself, and one of the most significant marks made by this franchise on the overall tapestry of science fiction, I think. Okay, next up we've got the Minerva-class light battlestar, another light battlestar, much like the Artemis, although this one's a little bit newer, and it also served as the design template that the Colonials later went back to as the basis for the design of the Mercury class, which is interesting because from a tactical standpoint, the Minerva and the Mercury are completely different. The Mercury is a giant tank built to be adaptable and carry a huge number of fighters, absorb massive amounts of firepower, and deal out enormous amounts of firepower. The Minerva is far more specific in its role. It is a glass cannon in the truest sense of the term. It's fast, very lightly armoured, agile, and loaded with powerful forward and dorsal weaponry, as well as lots of missile and torpedo tubes in an attempt to wear down and destroy Cylon warships as quickly as possible in the opening moments of an engagement. Immediately you can see the design similarities to the later Mercury, the differences being that the Minerva doesn't have the later inverted flight pods that the Pegasus and other ships of the Mercury class have, and also the engine assembly is different on the Minerva, looking a bit more like something the Artemis has or the original series Galactica had, rather than the giant cluster of individual engine nacelles arranged in a hexagon like the Mercury class has. It's also interesting how the central sort of frame of the Minerva is a lot narrower and has longer support struts connecting to the flight pods that gives the whole ship a more kind of skeletal look and communicates its fragility a little bit better to pin down its role as the quick and deadly attack ship. It's interesting to see a battlestar given such a specific role, since battlestars by their nature are multi-purpose platforms. Of the Canon battlestars we've seen on screen, the Minerva and I'd say the Orion are probably the fairest to describe as just about being battlestars. They're still very specialised in their roles, and they occasionally fall into the areas that are normally filled by non-battlestar smaller warships. Again, the Minerva is a first Cylon War design, later than the Artemis and the Jupiter, but presumably older than the Valkyrie and the Orion. We have no reason to believe any of these ships are still in service by the time of the Second Cylon War, or even by the time of the end of the First Cylon War, but the importance of this design to the overall timeline of colonial shipbuilding is obvious, as it resulted in the Mercury class, which is one of the dominating ship designs of the modern colonial fleet by the time the show kicks off. Again, another interesting stepping stone in the lore that allows us to piece together the lineage of battlestar design, which really adds a lot to the world building. Okay, before we jump on to the next ship, I just want to quickly let everyone know that this video is kindly sponsored by Battlestar Galactica DEADLOCK, the fantastic turn-based space combat strategy game that you can find on Steam and Good Old Games and various other places. As I'm sure many of you would know from things that I've said on this channel before, even if I wasn't being sponsored here, I would happily say that this is one of the best games I've played in the last few years. I've sunk hours and hours into it. It's one of the most entertaining space combat interfaces I've seen in a game. I hope that we get to see it applied in different settings in the future and with more Battlestar content, because it's just a fantastic template for illustrating space combat in 3 dimensions. It's also got a completely canon story, delving into the First Cylon War. It's responsible for many of the awesome ships I've already listed off here, as well as some other gorgeous, smaller designs and ships for the Cylons. It's got a full strategic interface for the campaign, as well as multiplayer and skirmish battles, etc. You may have seen us stream it before on twitch.tv/SpacedockHQ. Either way, I would heartily recommend that you check it out, and if you do want to pick up a copy of Battlestar Galactica DEADLOCK, I would encourage you to use the link in the description below, as any copy of the game that you purchase through that link will help Spacedock out and provide us with a bit of extra revenue to support the channel. So please do consider looking into it if you're interested. It's a fantastic game and we'd really appreciate the support. Okay, back to the list. Next up, it's a really cool little design that sadly goes kind of under the radar in the canon, and I really wish we saw more of it. It's the Valkyrie class battlestar. This ship is extremely small to be a battlestar, somewhere around 700 meters, but it has a really cool take on the general battlestar shape, with a much sort of longer and narrower frame, kind of raised in the center with a sort of hump through the main hull, and then spindly flight pods that seem to be lacking launch tubes, instead relying entirely on conventional hangar decks. It seems that the Valkyrie class dominates the colonial fleet during the outbreak of the First Cylon War. Most ships in the colonial fleet are of Mercury or Valkyrie class, with the Valkyrie being the far more common. And despite it being hailed as a far newer and more advanced ship than the Jupiter, it seems to be only around 10 years newer than it, as we've seen it in Battlestar Galactica Blood and Chrome during the Ghost Fleet offensive, and even in that film it's talked about as though it's been around for a while and then brought back into service after having seemingly been destroyed in a kind of fake-out engagement. If I had to guess, I would say that the Valkyrie was fairly new at the time of Battlestar Galactica Blood and Chrome, so it's a late war design that was enduring enough to remain the mainstay of the colonial fleet by the time of the Second Cylon War. But as I say, that's conjecture, there's no canon to support that just yet, which is why this ship and the ship after it on this list are a little interchangeable in chronology. This is the only Battlestar that we ever see on screen in a show rather than a game firing a missile. It seems to have broadside guided missile tubes, and by missile I of course mean conventional missiles. We know the Galactica has VLS nuclear missiles, but we see the Valkyrie firing standard conventional guided warheads in the episode Hero, which is an interesting angle for this ship to take. Another interesting thing I like about this ship is that the entire underside of the ventral hull is very, very exposed with lots of greeblies, and you can actually see the exposed FTL drive underneath. It gives the impression of something that would be built en masse, and the amount of them that we see seems to support this as a kind of cheaper, more vulnerable ship that works better in formations and supporting larger vessels. It's a very cool design and a very logical and interesting extension of the colonial fleet aesthetic and naval structure in the series. Really wish we'd seen more of this. Hopefully we'll get it in one of the games or something in future, or in another DLC pack for Deadlock or a sequel or something, because I'd really love it if this ship had a chance to really get the spotlight. And here we have another, I think, underappreciated Battlestar, the Orion class. This is described as a pocket Battlestar. We know that it has DRADIS reflecting stealth paneling, which again I think makes it a very specific and specialized warship in the same kind of way as the Minerva. It's also very, very small. I think the smallest ship ever to be called a Battlestar in canon, with it having a lot more in common scale-wise with normal colonial warships. The only ship of this class we ever see on screen is the Battlestar Osiris in Blood and Chrome, which has a very cramped and hostile kind of interior what seems to be very hot and uncomfortable, possibly as a result of heat buildup from internal heat sink systems meant to hide the ship's thermal signature from other vessels. The ship is clearly very maneuverable and nimble. We see it dodging through a battle with a Cylon base star in Blood and Chrome. As another unique feature for Battlestar Galactica, this ship has interceptor missile arrays for neutralizing incoming ordnance from Cylon ships. This is something we don't see anywhere else in the canon, and is fairly rare in science fiction in general. Again, I get the impression that this is a rapidly put together late war emergency design. It's very skeletal and small, with lots of greeblies and sensor arrays hanging off it. We also see other ships similar to it in the Ghost Fleet that have design differences but clearly use the same kind of frame, which seems to suggest there's a lot of modularity and recycling going on with the colonial fleet at this time, which makes sense in the 10th year of the war, after resources are low and everything has been worn away through the conflict. We know that the ship has a crew of 150 and carries Mark III Vipers, at least in Blood and Chrome. We can probably infer that it carried Mark II Vipers earlier if the design is old enough to accommodate that, but again, we don't know whether this ship is newer or older than the Valkyrie class. We can only estimate that they were both brought into service around this time. It's also impossible to say whether any of these ships stayed in service long enough to be blown up at the start of the Second Cylon War, or if the Cylons ever found a way to adapt to the DRADIS reflecting, which would have rendered stealth ships like this irrelevant. Overall, a really cool design, again something that could potentially have a lot of interesting gameplay features if it was brought into a future Battlestar game, but really in any form I'd quite like to see this given the spotlight again. It's always nice to see these background ships given a little bit more space to fall into the public eye a little. I think they deserve that kind of attention because they've obviously been very carefully designed. Lots of awesome VFX work and design time has gone into these ships, and I'd be very happy if we saw the Orion class make a return in future. And at last we have come to the newest and, in my opinion, best Battlestar design, the awesome Mercury class. This is legitimately one of my favourite designs for any ship in all of science fiction. It's like top 5. Its overall shape is generally inspired by the original series Galactica, but it's been put together in this awesome style. The sloped paneling on the flight pods, the inverted launch bays are a genius move. The ship looks sophisticated and powerful and robust. Its image and presence on screen gives it exactly the vibe of advantage that was supposed to be there when it arrives to the colonial fleet in that one episode of Galactica. You understand how much of a significant paradigm shift this is for the colonial fleet. Not only do they have a new warship to help them out a bit, but they've got the perfect ship for their situation. The Mercury class has onboard Viper assembly facilities and VR training suites to produce new fighters and train more pilots. It's armed to the teeth with powerful cannons on the bow, which we see cut down base stars in one salvo. It's covered in broadside weapons and flak batteries hidden between panels of the armor. Nebula. It's got smaller service bays on the top of its flight pods that Raptors and shuttle transports can use. Even the interior design is gorgeous. I love the Pegasus CIC with the folding glass doors, the green backlit tactical plots, and the Pegasus emblem pressed into the glass. It's just a gorgeous ship, inside and out. The apex of Battlestar Galactica ship design, as far as I'm concerned, contended only by the Adamant-class frigate from DEADLOCK, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous ship. You all know my thoughts on how this vessel was tragically wasted by Leodama in the Battle of New Caprica using idiotic tactics and extremely broken logic, and I am considering doing a video where I talk about some of the later battles in the series and suggest how they might have gone had the Pegasus still been around to help out, like the Battle of the Ionian Nebula and the Battle of the Colony, etc. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be an interesting idea. But either way, this ship is simply a masterclass in design. I don't know if we'll ever see it again. I suppose it would demand some kind of Battlestar content set around the modern era of the Second Cylon War, etc., or shortly before, so I'm not really holding out hope. But we got plenty of great sequences with this in the show, and I'm so glad that we were introduced to this ship and it got its moments in the sun throughout the end of Season 2 and early Season 3. Battlestar Galactica is a franchise that I think is loaded to the top with brilliant ship design. Especially for the Colonials, there are basically no bad options. Every design one-ups the previous one. It's a collection of really, really great ships, but I think for me this is the apex, and I just loved every moment that this ship was on screen. Thank you all for watching. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thanks for watching that one, everyone, and again, if you'd like to pick up a fantastic PC strategy game whilst also supporting Spacedock, please do consider clicking the affiliate link in the description and picking up Battlestar Galactica DEADLOCK. It's a fantastic game, and you should totally check it out.